Dr. Harris,
Yes?
do you concur
Concur with what, sir?
with what Dr. Ashland just said? Do you concur?
To be honest, I was never really inclined to watch Steven Spielberg's 2002 film Catch Me If You Can before I watched it, mostly because it seemed to me like just another procedural crime movie, which definitely isn't my favorite genre. I often find them bleak, boring, depressing, formulaic, whatever. That's a discussion for another day. Either way, I eventually ended up watching Catch Me If You Can, and it wasn't any of those things. I loved it, and I think that's mostly because it felt different than any other movie I'd seen before. Inspired by the true story of Frank William Abagnale Jr., Catch Me If You Can follows Frank's escapades of being a con man. Successfully posing as an airplane pilot, a doctor, and an attorney, Frank is able to evade the FBI for years while passing $4 million in bad checks. Although very successful as a con artist, Frank is eventually caught by the FBI agent Carl Hanratty and ultimately ends up putting his questionable talents to good use by working for the feds. While the plot isn't anything remarkably complex, what I find most unique about Catch Me If You Can is that it doesn't really fit into any single genre. It's equal parts biographical, crime, procedural, and drama. It's biographical in that it follows the events which the real Frank Abagnale faced. It's a crime/procedural film, as the go-to activity of the main character, Frank, is committing crimes, and the main activity of the supporting character, Carl Hanratty, along with the rest of the FBI, is tracking Frank down, so procedural. While both the biographical and crime aspects are apparent, perhaps the largest and most prominent part of the film is the drama side. The subtextual plot present throughout the entire film is one that focuses on Frank dealing with who he is as a person, his relationship with his father, coming to terms with his dysfunctional childhood, and how he affects the people around him. The guilt, fear, and other conflicting emotions that emanate from Frank and his complex relationship with Carl Hanratty is what breathes life into the movie, keeping us hooked and invested from beginning to end. So in order to dive deep and get a better understanding of the film, we have to go back to the beginning. Catch Me If You Can is set in the 1960s, where the Abagnale family are chasing the American dream. Christopher Walken plays Frank Abagnale Sr., a man acting one life and living another. The first scene we see him in, he's accepted into a Rotary Club and gives a speech on success. Not much later, we find he is in a lot of trouble with the IRS. His son, Frank, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, idolizes his father and initially seeks to adopt his father's dream by becoming successful through fraud, but must also come face to face with the fact that his family life is flawed and his father's dream is not one worth pursuing. Carl Hanratty, played by Tom Hanks, is almost a foil to Frank's father. Though spending most of the movie chasing Frank, he acts as a steadfast tether and is the element which eventually brings Frank out of his facade. The tone of the entire movie is set within the first two scenes. The first scene opens with the protagonist, Frank, appearing on a brightly colored television game show called To Tell the Truth. The game show idolizes fraud, and Leonardo DiCaprio is shown appearing mischievous but relaxed as his achievements and accolades are put on display. The next scene is an abrupt change, and it shows Frank stuck in a dark, wet French prison after he was caught for his crimes. These two juxtaposing scenes highlight how Frank Abagnale appears and how he actually is. Frank is a con man. He impersonates different successful lives, and so many of the shots showing this off seem to be in an almost dreamlike scene, while when reality comes back to hit him, the scenes become dark and gritty. The movie is a fantastic example of a transformational arc. Frank starts as a smart, mischievous teenager who initially only does evil to survive. Once he had become steeped and comfortable in his con life, though he had fulfilled the goal he inherited from his father, he realizes he is still unhappy. Let's take a closer look at his transformation throughout the movie. The movie can be loosely split up into 3 acts. The first sets the stage for who Frank Abagnale is, what he wants, and what his world looks like. Frank Jr. starts as just a regular kid who looks up to his dad and eventually wants to be what he sees, that is, successful, rich, and respected. The inciting incident which propels Frank into a life of fraud is when the image of his dad is shaken when Frank's father loses the house to IRS debt. He is also introduced to the power of fraud and impersonation by taking over a French class by pretending to be the teacher. Here he dips into what Bonnet would call the lower dimension as he manipulates others for his own gain. He unintentionally falls further into these lower dimensions when he flees his family when he is forced to choose between living with his father or mother when they get a divorce. The second act contains contains the meat of the movie, as Frank makes the transformational journey from doing evil because he has to realizing that the fraudulent life he had been living isn't sustainable. After learning how to forge basic checks, he eventually starts to impersonate an aircraft pilot. At this point, Frank is in full swing con mode, with little or no regard for others, and in his arrogance is almost caught by Carl Hanratty.
Drop it! Relax! You're late, all right? My name's Alan, Barry Allen, United States Secret Service. Your boy just tried to jump out the window. My partner has him in custody.
I don't know what you're talking about.
What, you think the FBI are the only ones on this guy? I mean, come on. Come on, he's dabbling in government checks here. I've been following a paper trail on this guy for months now.
This is the first time the two characters meet, and Frank pretends to be something he isn't, a CIA agent.
Sure thing, just do me a favor and sit tight for a second while I get this evidence downstairs. You know, I don't want some maid walking through here and making the bed. LAPD should be here any sec.
Though he is able to escape, Frank feels the cold touch of reality as he sees that his actions have consequences and his easy-go-lucky life will now have to be one on the run from the FBI. Frank then becomes a doctor to evade the FBI and falls for a girl, Brenda. Due to his romantic interest, he starts thinking about someone else besides himself, and he starts to fantasize about settling down and leading a normal life. Frank is transitioning from thinking about trying to become his father's goal to having a goal of his own. Later on, Frank finds out his mother has remarried and recklessly calls Carl on Christmas Eve out of loneliness. He is desperately trying to mend his old family and build a new one, both of which are fake and false. And the truth is, even with all his wealth and fake titles, he is still a kid who can't face the fact that his parents are split up and he is alone. The third act is the climax and the resulting aftermath. Carl is caught and must face reality as well as the consequences of his actions. After years of evasion, Frank is finally cornered and caught in France. As Frank had been on the run, he had not heard his father had passed. Distraught, he flees the FBI and goes to the last bastion of his old life, his mother, where he finds her remarried with a child. The fantasy of being a successful, rich individual with a proper family is finally shown to be what it is, fake, and Frank gives himself up and finally faces reality. Carl Hanratty, who is always his pursuer, reaches out to Frank and offers him a new life as an FBI consultant. And though Frank considers running yet again, Carl tells him that this time,
Nobody's chasing you.
Catch Me If You Can is about truth and identity. If we go back to the first scene of the movie, it's not a coincidence that Frank appears on a game show called To Tell the Truth, and the goal of the game show is to figure out who the real Frank Abagnale is. Understanding one's own identity is an integral step to achieving self-actualization. To know who you are, what you are, and why you are seen as fundamental to achieving happiness and contentedness. What we see in Catch Me If You Can is false identity.
Frank, would you like to say grace? Unless you're not comfortable.
Absolutely.
Two little mice fell into a bucket of cream. The first mouse quickly gave up and drowned, but the second mouse, he struggled so hard that he eventually churned that cream into butter. And he walked out. Amen.
Amen.
Oh, man. Oh, that was beautiful.
Frank Sr. masquerades as a successful businessman while being brought to ruin through his own con. For most of the movie, Frank Jr. follows in his father's footsteps by living a life he doesn't truly have, but it takes the help of Carl Hanratty to help Frank realize who he really is, and gives him a chance to become his own person rather than have to pretend. Trying to force an identity only ruins your real one. Even when Frank Jr. is living an arguably successful life impersonating others, he still finds himself longing for stability and a family he never had. Frank was only able to come to terms with who he was when his impersonated lives are taken away from him, and Carl Hanratty demonstrates that nobody is chasing him, much less caring for him. So in conclusion, Catch Me If You Can easily be underestimated. Since it's largely based on real-life events, it can't be made into a perfect fictional story, and it doesn't try to. It is an extremely well-crafted, balanced piece of cinema with incredible acting and rich subtextual storytelling. Frank Abagnale's search for truth and identity gives the film an emotional core that elevates a run-of-the-mill biopic into a profound exploration of the human condition, making Catch Me If You Can something I would consider to be, without a doubt in my mind, a classic.